Welcome to STEM Talk.
STEM Talk. STEM Talk. STEM Talk.
STEM Talk. STEM Talk.
Welcome to STEM Talk, where we introduce you to fascinating people who passionately inhabit the scientific and technical frontiers of our society. Hi, I'm your host, Don Carnegas, and joining me to introduce today's podcast is the man behind the curtain, Dr. Ken Ford, IHMC's director and chairman of the Double Secret Selection Committee that selects all the guests to appear on STEM Talk.
Hi, Don. Great to be here.
Before we get to today's interview with Gary, we have some housekeeping to take care of. First, we really appreciate all of you who have subscribed to STEM Talk, and we are especially appreciative of all the wonderful 5-star reviews that are piling up on iTunes.
iTunes reviews really help others find out about STEM Talk. So if you like the show, please take a moment and write a review. Pretty
please. As we announced in several earlier episodes, the Double Secret Selection Committee has been continually and carefully reviewing the iTunes reviews with an eye towards selecting the wittiest and lavishly praise-filled reviews to read on STEM Talk. As always, if you hear your review read on STEM Talk, just contact us at stemtalk@ihmc.us to claim your official STEM Talk t-shirt.
Today, our winning review was posted by someone who goes by the nickname Sailor Girl in Paradise.
That's a great nickname.
Super nickname. Points for the name alone.
Yep.
She writes, I was captivated by the recent episode with Stuart McGill on the mechanics of back pain and the secrets to a healthy spine. This is a subject of great interest to me, but whether you have a current back problem or you just want to keep a healthy back, you need to listen to this fascinating talk. The 2 hours fly by, and you will learn the essentials to back health and a few other things too. Thank you, Ken, and the team at IHMC for bringing in these experts and sharing the information with us. Please keep up the good work.
Well, thank you, Sailor Girl in Paradise, and thank you to all the other STEM Talk listeners who have helped STEM Talk get off to such a great start.
And now, on to today's interview with Gary Taubes.
Back in the 1970s, Gary Taubes wanted to be an astronaut. That's how he ended up at Harvard University studying physics and getting a master's degree at Stanford University in aeronautical engineering. But while at Stanford, Gary realized he wasn't that passionate about becoming an aeronautical engineer and decided to enroll at the Columbia School of Journalism to become an investigative reporter.
In the 1980s, Gary became fascinated with flawed science and started writing a series of magazine articles about bad science and eventually a pair of books titled Nobel Dreams in 1987 and Bad Science, The Short Life in Weird Times of Cold Fusion in 1993. After Bad Science, Gary turned to nutrition reporting, and that led to a 2002 article in the New York Times Magazine titled, What If It's All Been a Big Fat Lie? The article questioned low-fat diets and provided an overview of extensive research that showed high-fat, low-carb diets had a better scientific record of helping people lose weight than low-fat diets.
And Gary followed up on this article with 2 books, Good Calories, Bad Calories in 2007 and Why We Get Fat in 2010. Both books detailed how refined carbohydrates are largely responsible for America's rising obesity rate and a primary cause of heart disease, diabetes, cancer, and other chronic diseases of the Western diet. His new book, The Case Against Sugar, takes this argument a step further and shows how the explosion of sugar consumption and sugar-rich products in the United States has led to a global diabetes epidemic.
Don Barber, author of The Third Plate, wrote in a New York Times review of Gary's book, comparing the dangers of inhaling cigarettes. Well, you don't actually inhale cigarettes. That would be really dangerous. You just snorted a cigarette. Is that really what he said, inhaling cigarettes? Anyway, I'll try it again. Comparing the dangers of inhaling cigarettes with chowing down on candy bars may sound like a false equivalence, but Gary Taubes' The Case Against Sugar will persuade you otherwise. Here's a book on sugar that sugarcoats nothing. The stuff kills.
STEM Talk. STEM Talk. STEM Talk.
STEM Talk. STEM Talk.
Hi, welcome to STEM Talk. I'm Don Carnegas, your host, and joining us today is Gary Taubes.
Thank you for having me.
Yeah, and we also have Ken Ford here joining me for today's interview.
Hi, Ken.
Hi, Gary. So you had an interesting academic career, moving from studying physics as an undergrad at Harvard to obtaining a master's in aerospace engineering at Stanford to a master's in journalism at Columbia.
Yeah, so Gary, tell us about how someone who wanted to be an astronaut and as a result went to school to study physics and aeronautical engineering became one of the nation's leading journalists and investigators of nutrition science. How did that happen?
Okay, so first of all, my junior year I got a C- in quantum physics. Something called the Hamiltonian kind of threw me out of physics, like a speed bump might throw you off the... So my advisor suggested I find a new career anyway. I went to Stanford because I wanted to stay in school, and I was still thinking about being an astronaut, and they were foolish enough to give me a scholarship. I think my advisor is still trying to get that money back 40 years later. And anyway, clearly, first of all, I lived with a lot of, when I was at Stanford, I lived with a lot of naval pilots who lived in my apartment building, and I realized that I would not actually survive in a military hierarchy where you had to be deferential to anyone above you on the hierarchy. And also at the time, I was a football player. I weigh around 220 pounds, and it seemed kind of cost ineffective to have a 220-pound astronaut when you could find a 150-pound man who's smarter and cheaper to put into orbit. So from Stanford, I decided to pursue journalism, which had always been one of my loves. I took writing classes at Harvard. I went to Columbia Journalism School. When I got out of journalism school, I wanted to be an investigative reporter, but since I had no journalism background, I hadn't worked for my high school paper, my college paper, or the Stanford paper. The best job offer I got was as a science journalist, and in part because they were impressed by this Harvard physics, Stanford engineering background. And science journalism was considered a big career of the future in 1980, 81. And so I went to work at Discover magazine, and a few years in, I realized that there was a call for investigative journalism in science, that a lot of scientists did substandard work, not just malpractice, but what I consider a kind of scientific misconduct, where you just do such sloppy work that you claim to discover phenomena that don't exist. And my first two books were about just such escapades. The first one was I was embedded at CERN, the big the European High Energy Physics Laboratory, and I lived there for 10 months while I watched some very, very smart high energy physicists led by a Nobel laureate discover non-existent elementary particles and realize how they had screwed up. And then even how they should perhaps spin their report on it so that they didn't have to acknowledge having screwed up. And my second book was on cold fusion, this great scientific fiasco of the late 1980s, and I got obsessed with this subject and in general how hard it is to do science right. So when you're writing about controversial science and what physicists would call pathological science, which is the science of things that aren't so, what you're writing about, in effect, is how difficult it is to get the right answer in science and how easy it is to screw up, and how all of science, as a Nobel laureate Richard Feynman put it, he said, the first principle of science is you must not fool yourself, and you're the easiest person to fool. And I think all of my books, all of them, even including this latest one on sugar, are basically about good science and bad science and how easy it is to fool yourself. And that's what my obsession is, my passion. And when I finished the cold fusion book, I had a lot of fans and allies and friends in the physics community who said to me, in effect, if you are interested in pathological science and bad science, you should look at some of this stuff in public health because it's terrible.
Yep.
And they were thinking in particular of this idea that electromagnetic fields from power lines cause cancer or leukemia or brain cancer. That idea is still with us today, as cell phones cause cancer. And it's always been dependent on the field of observational epidemiology, sort of chronic disease epidemiology. And I did an investigation on that for The Atlantic back, I think it was 1993. And everything I had learned from the physics community, not just the physics community, but some brilliant experimental scientists, about how hard it is to do science right, and so how rigorous and meticulous and skeptical you have to be at every step of the way to assure you don't fool yourself. I won't even say that, to minimize the possibility that you're not fooling yourself. All of that was considered sort of luxuries in epidemiology that they didn't have to do because it was too hard. And what I had learned was if you don't do it, you get the wrong answer. So I did a piece for Science on epidemiology that's still famous or infamous 25 years later, called Epidemiology Faces Its Limits, in which I began to discuss these problems. And then in the late 90s, I kind of stumbled into the nutrition field. Pure serendipity, this issue of whether or not salt causes high blood pressure. And I realized that the science in nutrition was even worse than, well, I don't know if it was worse, but it was as bad as it was with the electromagnetic field story. And I did a series of investigations for Science, first on whether salt causes high blood pressure, and then on the evidence supporting this idea that dietary fat causes heart disease, which was the dominant dietary dogma from roughly 1977 onward. It's what we all grew up believing, that the essence of a healthy diet is a low-fat, low-saturated fat diet. And in both cases, you wouldn't believe, unless God had sat you down personally and told you that salt causes high blood pressure and dietary fat causes heart disease, if you actually looked at the data and were at all critical and skeptical, you would not conclude that the data supported those hypotheses.
Well, we're lucky that you ran into Hamiltonians, and the world was spared an extra physicist, but
not just an extra physicist, an extra third-rate physicist.
So we're lucky. Don, in particular, is always wondering how to properly denote a particle, the wave mechanical description of particles. Mm-hmm. And so she's turning red now.
Yeah, thanks, Ken. I appreciate that.
I can tell you one funny story about all this. If, again, you wanted shorter stories, and I'm going to get a long one, but I used to joke that I had come out about 10 years after, it must have been in the mid-90s, I was at a physics conference, and I think it was Park City, Utah, and I was telling these physicists that the only thing I remembered from my Harvard physics education, that my father had spent a few $100,000 to put me through college, and the only thing I remembered was the left-hand rule, for currents going through a wire and, and curls around. And one of the physicists said to me, Gary, it's the right-hand rule.
Yeah.
I said, whatever you do, don't tell my father.
So, Gary, let's talk about your 2002 article in the New York Times Magazine, which I love the title, What If It's All Been a Big Fat Lie? I know this was considered rather controversial. So tell us why you wrote that piece, and then tell us about how it was received by both the public and also the nutrition communities.
Okay, so again, I had done these two stories for Science. First, concluding that the evidence that salt causes high blood pressure is just not sufficient to get to that point, and then the same for fat causing heart disease. I had been in conversations with an editor at the New York Times Magazine about what story I could do for them, and in 2001, when I started that story, the obesity epidemic itself was so new. Our awareness of it dates to 1995, and it wasn't really until 98 that we started showing up in the media. And you could date this upturn in obesity rates in the U.S. to between two National Health and Nutrition Examination surveys. So in effect, to the decade of the 1980s, late 1970s, 1980s, the obesity prevalence, the curve turns upward pretty steeply. So I had just proposed this article that we should try and figure out what the cause of the obesity epidemic was. And I had two hypotheses, because two things changed during that time period significantly. And if you assume that whatever caused the epidemic happened during that time period, which is not actually necessarily the case, but that was the assumption, then high fructose corn syrup came in. in 1977, and it saturated the beverage market, sugary beverage market by 1984. And caloric sweetener consumption, which includes high fructose corn syrup and cane and beet sugar, turned upward during that period for the first significant amount since, the 50 years earlier. And the other thing that happened is we embraced this belief system that low-fat diet is a healthy diet. So in the 1960s, early 1960s, conventional wisdom is that carbohydrates are uniquely fattening. Bread, pasta, potato, sweets, beer, carbohydrate-rich foods somehow cause you to accumulate fat. And then by the 1980s, with the exception of the beer, carbohydrates had become heart healthy diet foods, and we were all being told we should have pasta and bread, and baked potatoes became a sort of staple of the diet. And I had, while I was doing the dietary fat story, the head of the administrator at NIH, I think he was director of the Office of Disease Prevention, had said back in '84 when we put the whole country on a low-fat diet, we really didn't know whether it would reduce heart disease rates because we didn't have the evidence, but we were confident that it would reduce obesity rates because fat is the densest calories in the diet, and if you get people to eat fewer of these dense calories, they'll get thinner. And lo and behold, we have an obesity epidemic. So those were my hypotheses. Interestingly enough, the high fructose corn syrup one I kind of dismissed because I had food analysts reminding me that high fructose corn syrup and sugars, sucrose, are effectively the same. So you can't blame it on high fructose corn syrup independent of sugars. And then, meanwhile, I stumbled upon 5 studies, randomized controlled trials that compared the Atkins diet to a low-fat American Heart Association calorie-restricted diet. None of these had been published yet, but they'd all been discussed at conferences, so I could discuss them. So if you think about that, we had 2 dominant dogmas in this era of nutrition science. One was that fat people get fat because they consume more calories than they expend. So if you let an obese individual eat as many calories as they want, they're going to get fatter. And the other was that dietary fat causes heart disease, particularly saturated fat. So the Atkins diet was an ad libitum diet. You can eat as much, is an ad libitum diet. You can eat as much as you want, provided you don't eat carbohydrates. And it's pretty much a high-fat, high-saturated fat diet. So not only would you expect it to, in these trials, to make people fatter than the people who are being told to eat skinless chicken breasts and for lunch, a little piece of lettuce with a scoop of tuna salad on it, an ice cream scoop. But you would also expect it to increase their heart disease risk because of the saturated fat content. And in all 5 of the studies, the diet not only resulted in more weight loss, thus clearly not supporting the overeating hypothesis of obesity, but it also resulted in an improvement in heart disease risk factors. So to me, the Atkins diet was always the anomalous observation in this field. If we're going to believe that dietary fat causes heart disease, we have to be able to explain why a diet high in fat and saturated fat seems to improve heart disease risk factors. And if we're going to believe that eating too much causes obesity, we have to understand why when you compare a diet where you could eat as much as you want to a diet that's calorie restricted, they lose more weight on the eat as much as you want diet. It's just, again, it's science 101. It's these observations seem to refute our belief system. So that's what I wrote. And the idea, it was hard. I tried to keep Atkins safely buried in the story so it wouldn't outrage people, but my editors were smart enough to say Atkins is the elephant in the living room, put him in the lead, which I did. I wrote this lead that if the medical organizations in America had a find yourself naked in Times Square type nightmare, it would be finding out not only that dietary fat doesn't cause heart disease, but that of all people, Dr. Atkins was right all along. And I read it to my wife and I laughed, and I said, they'll never run this in a million years. And I sent it to the editors, and they didn't change a word.
Yeah, it's great.
Awesome.
So that was it. And then, it was the photo on the cover. I actually recently did an appearance with the editor at the time who helped me on the story. And he told me that they had chosen this. It's a porterhouse steak with a pat of butter on it. And they said they chose a steak that would look as greasy and unappetizing as possible. So this was, in effect, a direct challenge to the medical establishment, the nutritional establishment, and it implied that they had screwed up on a monumental and vitally important subject. And needless to say, they didn't appreciate journalists coming along and making that accusation, particularly doing it in a venue as influential as the New York Times Magazine. So I expected it to be controversial, but I was kind of stunned by the blowback I got, not just from the researchers themselves, but not even from the researchers themselves, but from my journalistic colleagues who, I was implying that they missed the story as well. And if I was right, they simply missed the story, and none of us want to believe that. So they felt compelled to explain why, from their perspective, I was wrong, and that meant, in effect, explaining why, from their perspective, I was an idiot. And perhaps a corrupt one who was only doing this to get a good book deal.
No doubt.
Speaking of books, let's move on to your book, Good Calories, Bad Calories. So you talk about this alternative hypothesis. Can you talk about that a little bit more and expand on it?
Yeah. So one advantage to doing such an influential, controversial cover story with the New York Times Magazine is you get a big book advance. But the advance gave me the opportunity to spend, in effect, the next 4 years of my life doing research on this subject, and that happened to coincide with a new technology appearing. That science moves forward with new technologies, so you can learn things you never learned because you can look at variables you can never look at before, measure things you can never measure before. So in this case, the new technology was the internet. And the internet allowed me to do in 5 years what would have taken a lifetime pre-internet. I would have had to, in effect, live in various university libraries, taking copious notes. And instead, back then you couldn't download virtually everything the way you can today, but I had researchers in New York, Boston, and Los Angeles, young students whose only job was to get an email from me about once a month with 50 or 100 references, and then to go to the library and Xerox those references and ship them to me. In the process, also, all used bookstores started putting their catalogs online, so you could buy books and conference proceedings. So I could literally reconstruct the history of obesity research from the conference proceedings, where pre-1985 or so, the conferences were infrequent enough that every major researcher would show up and discuss what they had been doing and present their best evidence for whatever argument they were making. And these conference proceedings, libraries got tired of collecting conference proceedings after a few decades, so you sell them for like $7, or you give them to a bookstore, and then I could purchase them and have them delivered. So by the end of my book, I probably had one of the top 2 or 3 private collections in the world on obesity texts and proceedings, and so I could recreate all that history. And the gist of it, one of the things I learned in doing that research is pre-1940, and I had no idea about this, and I still find it fascinating. So the lingua franca of science prior to the Second World War was German. If you wanted to do meaningful science, you had to both at least read German, so you could read the German language literature, ideally speak it so you could go to Germany and Austria and mentor with these great scientists. And if you were to ask you to name 5 famous scientists off the top of your head pre-1950, almost assuredly they would be, Heisenberg, Schrodinger, Planck, Einstein, we'll throw in Bohr. So the Germans, Austrians, and a Scandinavian. The same thing was true in medicine. Okay, the same the height of medical science was Germany and Austria pre-World War II. All the fields relevant to obesity and diabetes were pioneered in Europe and came out of Germany and Austria. So endocrinology, metabolism, nutrition, genetics. And by the late 30s, these clinical investigators had concluded that obesity had to be a hormonal metabolic defect, that there was no way to explain it. And the way fat accumulated and when fat accumulated and where fat accumulated and just the accumulation of fat on the human body and excess fat without evoking hormonal metabolic phenomena that were working. And the problem is this hypothesis, this thinking almost literally vanished with the Second World War. So not only did the lingua franca of science shift from German to English, but the researchers, the clinicians who reinvented the fields of obesity and nutrition post-war tended to be young American doctors and nutritionists who had fought in the war and wanted nothing to do with the German and Austrians, let alone read their literature. The Ivy League universities had protocols in place to prevent them from being overrun by Jewish academicians fleeing Europe. And many of these influential thinkers were Jews. And so this hypothesis evaporates, and it's replaced post-war by the simplistic idea that had been pushed by an American physician, Louis Newberg, that an American academician, he was at the University of Michigan, that obesity is clearly an energy balance disorder. It's caused by taking in more calories than you expend. Like, unbelievably naive theory, but we embrace it. By the 1960s, most obesity research in America is being pursued by psychologists and psychiatrists because they see it as an eating disorder. And they're trying to understand how to change the behavior such that fat people won't eat too much. And meanwhile, 1959-60, Yalow and Burson create the radioimmunoassay so you can measure hormones in the bloodstream for the first time ever accurately. A new technology emerges, and with it, the whole field of endocrinology matures in like 15 years overnight into a fully fledged field of medical science. And among the things you learn is that the hormone insulin is the primary factor regulating the accumulation of fat in fat cells. And it does so. We know the enzymes through which it, upregulates an enzyme called lipoprotein lipase. It pulls fat simplistically into whatever cell it's on. And if it's on a fat cell, it's going to pull it into the fat cell. And insulin downregulates hormone-sensitive lipase, which is in the fat cell, and breaks down triglycerides into fatty acids so they could get out. And clearly, by 1965, you should have had a hypothesis that said that anything that elevates insulin chronically is going to create a situation in the body where fuel is being partitioned into fat and excess calories are accumulating as fat and fat tissue is expanding. And when insulin is lowered, that fat is going to be mobilized. And that put the onus on carbohydrates. But we believed by then, as psychologists and psychiatrists weren't interested in endocrinology. They thought it was an eating disorder. That was a conventional wisdom. And meanwhile, and here's the link, physicians like Atkins come along, and they read this literature, and they say, hey, if insulin's driving fat accumulation and carbohydrates driving insulin, and if I have to lower insulin, if the fundamental requirement to get fat out of fat tissue is this reduction of insulin signaling, then what happens if I get rid of the carbohydrates which drive insulin up and replace it with fat, which is the one nutrient that doesn't stimulate insulin? And when these people tried it on themselves and their patients, they lost a lot of weight relatively effortlessly. And so they wrote diet books about it because they wanted to communicate to other people what they were clearly seeing in their practices. And the diet books sold, if you'll pardon the expression, like hotcakes. And they were advocating high-fat, high-saturated fat diets at a time when the nutrition and cardiology community had decided that high-fat, high-saturated fat diets will kill people by giving them heart disease. So you had this perfect storm of bad science on one hand and assumptions squelching, inhibiting the development of what should have been the sort of null hypothesis of obesity, that it's an insulin signaling disorder caused by the carbohydrate content of the diet, which also agreed with the conventional thinking until the 1960s, which were carbohydrates were fattening. So that's the alternative hypothesis. It's a biology problem, not a behavioral defect, and certainly not a physics problem. And if you look at the biology, the physiology, the endocrinology, it says get rid of the carbohydrates and replace it with fat, and people will get better. The fat will be mobilized and it'll be oxidized.
It's funny how we knew that and lost it. You know, in the 60s, even the late 60s, I was a wrestler and you have to cut a lot of weight. And the coaches wouldn't let you touch carbohydrates, right? It's just out of the question.
That's when Arnold Schwarzenegger came to the U.S. in the 60s to bodybuild on Venice Beach. His revolutionary bodybuilding coach was all about, if when you want to get cut for the competition, you get rid of the carbohydrates because you get rid of the excess fat accumulation by doing so.
You know, several of my particularly thoughtful friends who have read both Good Calories, Bad Calories and your latest book, The Case Against Sugar, have told me recently that they greatly appreciate your passion for pursuing what you might call the history of a theory, and you were just doing it there. And it makes these books particularly satisfying to read, and it seems like, you know, I see this in other sciences, but I don't see it much in nutrition, and I wondered if you had any thoughts on that.
Well, this is one of the points I've made in my writing. I grew up studying physics. And when you study physics, you get the science with the history attached, right? So you learn about, first we believed there was an ether, and then Michelson and Morley came along and did this experiment that seemed to refute the existence of the ether. And if your instructor is really good, he might even show you Michelson and Morley's data. Maxwell's equations are called Maxwell's equations. So there's a Maxwell attached to the equations themselves, and you learn all the great physicists. And you learn about Einstein, you learn about Newton, and then what Einstein's ideas, and Eddington going to South Africa to test relativity and by photographing the eclipse, and I forget if it was 1917 or 1918. And this is all part of the education, and it goes along with what scientists are taught, which is never trust anything that can't be proved. So by instructing young physicists not just on what they should know, but why they should know it, they understand to always look for the evidence base underneath assumptions. You don't treat anything as gospel or dogma until, ultimately the experiment after experiment after experiment has failed to refute this hypothesis, and you can embrace it. In nutrition and public health, very little, and obesity, very little of that history is taught, if any. So on occasions when I found myself in arguments with researchers or influential authorities about this idea that obesity is a caloric balance issue, I'll ask them, can you tell me the history of that belief? Where does it come from? It's actually not chiseled on stone tablets. It's not somehow a sub-paragraph under the laws of thermodynamics. So where does that belief system come from? Because I know. So I could tell you where it came from. I could tell you who first came up with it. I could tell you who was the proponent. I could tell you what the alternative hypothesis was. I could even show you a graph that I recently put together showing the alternative hypothesis dying during the Second World War, when the only existing tests in animals supported it. And this energy balance hypothesis carrying the day, despite the fact that all the animal experiments continued to support the energy balance, continued to support the sort of hormonal metabolic defect hypothesis of obesity, or the fuel partitioning hypothesis. So it's just part of what you would want any scientist to know. I remember Robert Merton, the philosopher of science. I quoted him at the end of the epilogue of Good Calories, Bad Calories, saying, everybody wants to know what is really true, but men of science want to know whether what they think is really true really is. And to understand why we believe something, you have to understand the history of that belief and what the competing hypotheses were, and whether the competing hypotheses were refuted or whether they were swept under the rug because they were inconvenient, or whether some very compelling, very charismatic scientist managed to convince people to believe one thing versus the other because the field itself lacked an understanding of the need to be skeptical and the need to understand the evidence base for these hypotheses. So I don't see how you can write about these ideas without writing about the history.
I'm glad you do, and people typically don't in nutrition and epidemiology, as you said. Some do, but it's rare.
I mean, you often see this thing whenever I say, there's a new book just came out on fat, roughly when my sugar book came out. And I saw a review and a quote by a researcher saying, we now know that fat tissue, adiposity, is an endocrine organ. And every time I see that, it makes my skin crawl, because the implication is that some new observation, and you can actually date it roughly to 1934, and another German emigre named Rudolf Schonheimer, who came to the U.S., got a job at Columbia University when Harold Urey was first discovering isotopes of hydrogen that could be used in these studies as trackers of dietary fat. And Schonheimer wrote a book about basically the constant... and he got some things wrong too, by the way. But anyway, this idea is at least 90 years old or 80 years old. And I could also show you books from the 1960s, conferences on fat tissue, adipose tissue as an endocrine organ. But the researchers today don't know that history. And it's funny, I was doing a BBC interview for a BBC show with the host was a geneticist I forget if it was Cambridge or Oxford, who studies obesity, the genetics of obesity. And I think he was a little angry at me because he was supposed to be interviewing me, and I kept asking him questions while the cameras were running. But I said, do you know what hormones and enzymes actually regulate fat accumulation in fat cells? And he said, no, we don't know that. And I said, no, you don't know that because you're a geneticist, not an endocrinologist. But if you go to the endocrinology textbooks, it's in there.
Well, sure. I mean, even muscle has an endocrine role as well. Skeletal muscle.
You would expect. I mean, again, evolution's a wonderful thing. It's not going to avoid, to ignore making use of feedback systems just because, I don't know why. I can't even begin to understand why, despite all my research, why anyone would think otherwise.
So, Gary, is it your position that people can lose weight without a caloric deficit as long as they restrict carbs?
It's my position that they could lose weight without a conscious caloric deficit. You have to explain what you mean by caloric deficit.
Well, I mean, if you enforced an absolute isocaloric comparison.
So if we could somehow establish how many calories we needed to use, I'll use me as an example. So I'm eating a standard American diet, and it's got a lot of refined grains and sugars, and I'm weight stable at, say, 230 pounds, and I could establish how much energy I'm expending, and precisely when I'm weight stable. So my body composition is stable. I establish how much energy I'm expending, and that the assumption is that's exactly how much energy as I'm taking in, because my body composition, so expending and excreting, so my body composition is stable. Or we could measure precisely how many calories I'm taking in, and let's assume it's 3,000 calories a day. Okay, so now the idea is we transition me to a diet of 3,000 calories a day, and we remove the carbohydrates and replace it with fat. So according to the endocrinological perspective, we're going to mobilize fat from the fat tissue and oxidize that fat. And there's no law of nature that says we can't oxidize more fuel than we're taking in. So now we're going to but we're keeping the caloric intake at 3,000 calories. In theory, just by lowering carbohydrates from low enough and replacing them by fat, we should be able to lose fat, increase our energy expenditure, because we're now oxidizing the fat we're losing, and we're de facto losing weight. So we've created a negative energy balance, or a caloric deficit, without changing our caloric intake, just by changing how we regulate our fat tissue.
Right.
And by the way, clearly this can be tested. What I just described can be tested. And the point is, will this happen to everyone? Because once you start mobilizing fat, let's say you're losing a pound of fat a week on a diet. That's 500, a pound of fat is roughly 3,500 calories a day. So that's 500 calories a day that you are oxidizing, mobilizing from your fat tissue and oxidizing it. You wouldn't be mobilizing and oxidizing if you were weight stable, okay? So one possibility is, you could oxidize that fat over and above the calories you're taking in on the diet that you're already oxidizing, or you might, because you could think of it as eating 500 calories a day of your fat tissue, you might be 500 calories a day less hungry. Fat is particularly satiating in theory. So you might just eat 500 calories less, or some combination of the two. But you wouldn't be losing weight because you're eating less. You'd be eating less because you're literally mobilizing fat from your fat tissue and oxidizing it. So you wouldn't need as many exogenous calories, because you would be burning endogenous calories, fueling your body with endogenous calories that prior to this change in diet composition were not accessible to you.
Right. I recall a rather amusing story that you shared a few years back when you were visiting IHMC and giving an evening lecture. It was about Greece. I don't remember where it was in Greece, but you said you spent your entire time hanging out with the locals who seemed to be constantly eating. And as I recall, you noticed that they didn't seem to be putting on, that you were putting on weight, but they didn't seem to be. And you asked them about it and why it was only you that was gaining weight and they weren't. And they said, well, it's because you're the only one eating bread.
Yeah, this was actually when I was living at CERN doing my first book.
It wasn't Greece. Oh, no.
Yeah, no, there were auberges, inns in the French countryside close to the laboratory. So Tuesdays and Thursdays, one of them was all the ham you could eat, one was all the leg of lamb you could eat. I'm a huge leg of lamb fan.
Lamb
and
would die.
Yeah, so we would go for lunch, myself and say 3 of the physicists. We would have 3 bottles of red wine between the 4 of us at lunch, and we would eat, 4 or 5 portions of lamb or ham, depending. And and then I finally said to them, I gained 15 pounds in the first 3 months.
That's what happens when Americans go to France in general for extended stays.
Yeah, I was traveling through France and I had a Frenchman come up to me and I was eating goat cheese and bread and he said, that's why you Americans are so fat. So
there we go.
He made a point of calling me out on it. So Gary, you were talking earlier about your experience with the Nutrition Science Initiative. Can you talk a little bit more about that and any lessons that you learned upon reflection of your experience with NUSI?
Yeah, so, our assumption in starting this experiment and starting NUSI was that we could induce the community, the research community, and influential members of the research community to do the kinds of experiments we thought were necessary to actually test their belief system. So this is probably as well as I do. In science, what you're testing is a null hypothesis. And in this field, although I think the null hypothesis should be obesity is an endocrinological problem, it's not. so far as those people are concerned, it was obesity is a energy balance issue. And so you have two hypotheses, as we've been discussing with your last question. You have two hypotheses. An ideal experiment will set up an experimental situation where your competing hypotheses make very different predictions. And if they make very different predictions, then you can then create that experimental scenario, whatever it is, and see which of the two predictions happens to pan out. And when you do that, the person who believes in one of the predictions will say, well, you didn't do this right, or you didn't do that right, or this is why the experiment screwed up. And so you'll redo the experiment with a different experimental scenario, hoping to take that into account. And you'll go back and forth, and you'll asymptotically converge, ideally, on one of the two hypotheses being refuted. That's my understanding of functional science. And we thought we could create this process if we had funding. We definitely had funding from Laura and John Arnold and their foundation in Houston. With Peter Attia's driving the show, basically, we put together, we facilitated and then funded the creation of 4 experiments, 2 of which were addressing the energy balance hypothesis directly. One of them is a pilot study looking at non-alcoholic fatty liver disease, and the other is a diet study looking at, this is another long story, but a healthy low-fat diet versus a healthy low-carbohydrate diet, and whether or not the low-carbohydrate diet, as the conventional wisdom would predict, increases heart disease risk factors. So that was our belief system. Once we actually started doing the experiment, and one of the things Peter and I talked about a lot is whether or not we could get the obesity research community to do the experiments up to our unrealistic, naive standards. We didn't realize they were unrealistic and naive. We just thought they were the standards that any science should reach, but we weren't obesity researchers, right? And what we found was that, my Good Calories, Bad Calories, the last chapter, the epilogue, where my editor kind of let me have my say, is somewhat of a referendum on the science in these fields. And I make the accusation in that epilogue that the obesity nutrition research is kind of a pseudoscience. It's people acting like they're scientists. They wear white coats. They use the language of science. They evoke the authority of science. But the research they do lacks the rigor and critical, meticulous, methodology needed to establish reliable knowledge. And what we learned in doing the experiment is that this isn't just a problem on the the big picture, 40,000 foot view downward. It's a problem when you're in the laboratory itself, that the same people who are doing what we consider correctly or incorrectly to be substandard science, on the big screen are doing it at the micro level also. So it just turned out to be a lot harder than we anticipated. And there was also just a fundamental problem, which is these people that we recruited to do the experiments legitimately think of themselves as authorities, right? Their whole lives, they've risen to the top of their professions by being perceived as authorities and experts and knowing what they're doing and knowing how to do it. And then somebody comes along, particularly, I think Peter had an easier time than I did because they saw him as a kindred spirit. He spoke the language of science. He had an MD, has an MD. In my case, I'm a journalist. I'm a provocateur. I'm implying that they don't know what they're doing. Our other science, aside from our scientific advisory board, we had a vice president of research, Mark Friedman, who's a PhD from the Monell Institute. And Mark had come up with a lot of the ideas back in the 70s that I sort of embraced in my thinking in Good Calories, Bad Calories, and all my work since then. And Mark was kind of perceived as an expert, but an outsider because he wasn't an obesity researcher. He was what's called a physiological psychologist. So when we argued that they weren't doing something right or they weren't interpreting the data right, their natural inclination was to think they're the experts, not us. us, what right do we have to make those arguments? We would say, well, look, we're doing the experiments to find out who's the expert. Okay, because if your thinking is wrong, clearly you guys aren't, but that wasn't a compelling argument to them.
No, I could have foreseen this bus wreck.
Yeah.
STEM Talk is an educational service of the Florida Institute for Human and Machine Cognition, a not-for-profit research lab pioneering groundbreaking technologies aimed at leveraging and extending human cognition, perception, locomotion, and resilience.
Kevin Hall, a young researcher at NIH, or relatively young, they all look young to me now, can be found all over the internet, essentially claiming that he's disproven the carbohydrate insulin hypotheses of obesity as the result of one of the studies funded by NUSI and I think maybe NIH as well. Originally, I saw a conference poster session when I first ran across this, and the poster had the kind of paradoxical title, Energy Expenditure Increases Following the Isocaloric Ketogenic Diet in Overweight and Obese Men. Now, it's only paradoxical if you see the video that, his interview that went with the poster. So in the interview, he says that an isocaloric ketogenic diet does not increase energy expenditure in the interview, and the title of the poster says the opposite. I didn't know if you had noticed that.
Yes, we noticed it.
It seems bizarre to me. And then later, they eventually published, I think it was last July, in the American Journal of Clinical Nutrition, sort of a final version. And it continues to poo-poo, which looks to be a rather significant increase in metabolism on a very low carbohydrate diet, and the title and abstract of the journal paper and the conference paper are very different in tone and content. And I was wondering if you had any thoughts on this particular study.
Yeah, I did, and I do. So remember when we described whether or not I thought somebody could lose weight on without a conscious calorie restriction, or perhaps without any change in intake, merely by changing the macronutrient content of what they're eating. So it's, again, the argument, simplistically, you'd say they could lose weight by changing what they eat, not how much. And when I described that, I said if you could, effectively what I was describing was what this pilot experiment did. The reason the pilot experiment did it is because this is the simplest way to think about it. And in doing so, I remember I said if we could figure out how much energy somebody was consuming and expending when they were in weight, their body composition was stable. So they're in energy balance. And in order to establish that, we have to know how much they're taking in, or at least how much they're taking out, expending, because the knowledge of energy balance is, if they're in energy balance and their body mass is stable and we know how much they're expending, then we know how much they have to be taking in. They have to be equal. So that was the fundamental requirement of the experiment. And as Kevin Hall and his colleagues explain in that paper, they failed to make that happen. So they have a hypothesis for why they failed, and we have a hypothesis for why they failed, and they're both hypotheses. And at one point I suggested that we do another relatively inexpensive study to find out whether either of these hypotheses look like they're actually true. But the experiment, would take the overweight subjects and put them on what was supposed to be a standard American diet, but we screwed up that too. They like to say that because we were involved in screwing that up, therefore the fact that it wasn't a standard American diet doesn't matter. My response is, well, it's not about who's to blame. We'll take the blame, but the diet that they were run in on was a problem. Anyway, on the run-in period, they were supposed to get them into energy balance so their body composition is stable, and they failed to do so. They got them in energy balance apparently in the 2 days they were in metabolic chambers every week, but they were out of the chambers 5 days a week. and they were in negative energy balance during the 5 days. And because of that, the study, well, you wouldn't be able to interpret it as Kevin and his colleagues do anyway, because it's a non-randomized trial, and without randomization, you can't assume causal inference. And I think biostatisticians will back me up on that, with the possible exception of things like cigarettes and lung cancer, where you have effects so huge that you can't imagine any other way to explain them but causal. So you end up with the situation where if it was a rat experiment, it might have cost $50,000. And I think they'd euthanize the rats at the end. And if your graduate student was doing it and you were his mentor, you would say, look, this experimental model was dependent on the getting them in energy balance in the run-in. They were clearly in negative energy balance. So this experiment's failed. Let's just get rid of the rats and design another one. Because it's a human experiment, it costs $4.5 million. For whatever reason, that's a rationale for Kevin and his colleagues to say it doesn't matter that we failed to get them into energy balance. It doesn't matter that we don't really know why we failed. We have a hypothesis, but we're going to assume that that's the reason, and now we're going to interpret without randomization what happened next. What's embarrassing to me, so from Nusi's perspective, we were in a bad position. We would, and our scientific advisory board, explain to them all the reasons why they were overinterpreting the data, or what we believe was incorrectly interpreting them. And our scientific advisory board is made up of very good scientists. They like us, and they think we probably mostly right. They don't at all have our biases or our, they're not invested in the hypothesis being true the way I clearly am. But these people had convinced themselves that if they took our suggestions to heart, we would be influencing their interpretation of the data. And Kevin in particular argued this over and over again, almost walked out of a meeting we had in Houston because he felt his ethical integrity was on the line if he let us influence his interpretation of the data. And so, what's embarrassing from our perspective is we funded a failed study, and failed studies are valuable because you learn what doesn't work. So there's nothing you can do about that, and it's the nature of science. It's a shame it's so expensive in this kind of science, but it is. It's that the failed study was then overinterpreted by the investigators, and there was nothing we could do about it. We were the funders. We were the rivals. They were not going to let us dictate what went in the paper, and we had a legal contract which said they were in charge of writing. They dictated the final word, and they decided that it was important to them for whatever reason to overinterpret this result. And I think Kevin would say, and he might have on the air, that of course I'm saying this because I don't like the results. They weren't positive, but you could make the argument, as you did by pointing out that headline, that they indeed were positive and did support or did seem to refute the null hypothesis had they chosen to interpret this trial as a test of the null hypothesis, which is another argument we had with them from the get-go.
So it's essentially, at the end of the day, it's an issue of spin versus looking at the data at hand. It's really, and you see that a lot actually in the media today in a lot of different areas, not just specific to this study.
End of the first introductory chapter of Good Calories, Bad Calories, I described how I did the research and the standards I held myself to. So the third to last paragraph in this chapter says, throughout this process, I'm reading from it, I necessarily made judgments about the quality of the researcher and about the researchers themselves. I tried to do so based on what I considered the fundamental requirement of good science, a relentless honesty in describing precisely what was done in any particular work, and a similar honesty in interpreting the results without distorting them to reflect preconceived opinions or personal preferences. And then I quoted Richard Feynman, the Nobel laureate who often says these things best. He said, if science is to progress, what we need is the ability to experiment, honesty in reporting results. The results must be reported without somebody saying what they would like the results to have been. And finally, an important thing, the intelligence to interpret the results. An important point about this intelligence is that it should not be sure ahead of time what must be. And then I said, this was the standard to which I held all relevant research and researchers. I hope that I too will be judged by the same standard. And what was embarrassing about all this is that despite all our best efforts, the researchers we funded, to me, failed that test. And the research, again, experiments fail. That's what they do more often than not. But you rely on the researchers to report those results without spinning them, and they didn't do that.
Yeah, a lot of media coverage on that, for sure.
Definitely.
Well, small-scale media coverage. Again, there's a lot of people out there still, and some very influential journalists, one at the New York Times in particular, who, if I'm right, she's wrong and hasn't done her job right. And so to those people, Kevin Hall becomes the voice of scientific reason against this unscientific journalist who doesn't really get it and is so invested in his beliefs that he would rather, if he can make money, he doesn't care whether his ideas are right or wrong. That's the implication. So,
what has been the response in the community to the series of publications by Kevin Hall that we've been discussing? Has there been much community response?
Well, the community, of course, in this case tends to be the blogosphere that pays attention to this stuff, because the community at large that we're trying to influence doesn't. But David Ludwig, for instance, at Harvard, Boston Children's Hospital, has been one of the, if not the major academic proponent of this alternative hypothesis. Has written a series of letters, or a letter to the American Journal of Clinical Nutrition in response, pointing out that, in effect, what Kevin Hall and his colleagues saw in this study was actually supportive of what we would have expected them to see if this alternative hypothesis is right and the energy balance program is, the energy balance conception is wrong. And in fact, in a paper, Kevin Hall just published a meta-analysis looking at all these short-term metabolic ward studies. He actually included this latest study as more or less supporting the idea that the carbohydrate insulin hypothesis is correct. My take on all of this is, if you've got a whole lot of poorly done studies, the simplest way to put it is you've got a lot of noise, and what we need to do is generate a signal. And to generate a signal, you need a far better study than any that has been done in the past, which includes the study that this pilot study that NUSI funded.
We've been talking about this low-carb diet. I'm curious about what your thought is on the universality of diet. Do you think there are specific populations where it would seem less appropriate to be on a low-carb diet?
The arguments I'm making in my book is that sugars and highly refined grains, maybe starchy vegetables as well, are the fundamental causes of obesity and diabetes. And so virtually anyone should be expected to be healthier if they remove them from their diets. That would be my expectation. Are there exceptions to that rule? Clearly, there are people who thrive on high-carb, high-sugar diets, whether athletes or not. And there are probably people who live to be 100 on these diets, whether athletes or not. But there are also clearly people who can smoke cigarettes and live, 2 packs a day and live to be 100. So it doesn't mean the rest of us aren't all healthier if we don't smoke. So that's the argument I make.
That's a
great point.
Good answer.
Yeah. And so what do you see as the primary role of carbohydrates in the human diet? So, for example, fiber support for our gut bacteria, or minimal insulin stimulation to support our defense system. So how do you see carbohydrates playing a role in our diet now?
Well, and again, our diet now is the diet of a population in which arguably 2/3 of the people in it are have metabolic problems related to the carbohydrate content of the diet, if I'm right. Okay, so if we go back 200 years, pre-obesity epidemic, pre-diabetes epidemic, then the carbohydrates we were consuming them, we go to Southeast Asia 50 years ago, and then clearly people can thrive on these diets and get most of their calories from these diets, provided that grains are not exceedingly well processed and the sugar content is very low. Once you get a population like ours, where again 2/3 of the population is overweight, obese, and or diabetic, for those people, I suspect that the diets absent carbohydrates, other than in green leafy vegetables, and maybe for the more healthy ones of those, slow carbohydrates, to use Tim Ferriss's term, would be the healthiest diets.
Many folks, such as myself, when on very low-carb diets, such as ketogenic diets, experience a substantial increase in LDLP, the LDL particle number. And LDLP is often considered a more reliable predictor of cardiovascular events than LDL-C, the low-density lipoprotein cholesterol. Again, this is taken across the U.S. population that you just described. And I'm wondering, this may be outside your expertise, but I've been wondering, is the elevated LDLP absent inflammation and elevated insulin still a concern? So if you take somebody who's ketogenic and has rock-low insulin and rock-low inflammation, is the LDLP a concern? And it's hard to know that because they do these studies on normals, which, Homer Simpson.
All right, well, and you kind of answered that question for me. Actually, I'm pretty confident it's not specific to ketogenic diets. I once asked Rob Wolf about this. Do you see the same thing in people on paleo diets, which aren't necessarily ketogenic? And he said he sees the same thing. But it does seem to be a scenario that happens with, and we don't know, I can't say with some regularity, I don't know what that means because we don't have the studies to give us numerator and denominator, but it does seem to happen with, frequently with these diets. The question, and I don't know what the answer is, I don't think anyone does. Is it something of concern? Yeah, absolutely, because we have a medical community that's focused on LDL-C and probably should be obsessively focused on LDLP as a risk factor. But when all the other risk factors improve on these diets, is it possible that you have increased your risk of heart disease because one risk factor has gotten worse? And the answer is anything is possible. And we don't have the data, and so that becomes an area almost of personal preference and how much risk you're willing to accept. So I know people whose LDLP went up and whose inflammation, all the metabolic syndrome markers have vanished, and this is a diet at which they can maintain a healthy weight. And if there's one risk factor for heart disease that's more powerful than LDLP, it's clearly excess weight, excess adiposity. So they just assume that a diet that allows them to stay at a healthy weight is a healthy diet, and they're going to live with the LDLP and hope they're right. And I know other people who have changed their diet in such a way that's still very low carb, but not as low carb, and they have used nutritional changes to reduce their LDLP, and they think that's a reasonable approach. And I know people and physicians I would respect who would prescribe a statin or reach for a statin, a low-dose statin, to control the LDLP, but also stick with the diet. But yeah, is it a concern? Absolutely. Do we know what it means? Well, if someone does, God told them personally, because he didn't tell me.
Yeah,
she didn't tell me.
Yeah, the several physician types and scientists also on the ketogenic diet that I know are using, like 3 day a week ultra low dose, maybe 10 milligram statin, and maybe Zetia 3 days a week or something like that.
And if that helps, and again, I wish we had even more research on that. But if that's what it would take, that would seem like a perfectly reasonable compromise or as long as you're not getting some kind of side effect to the low dose or the occasional statin use.
Right. And the 3 or 4 people I know that fit that category that took that approach, it roughly moved their LDLP from the high hazard level to the good level, good to excellent level.
Yeah. I mean, one of the other things I'm always curious about is what kind of what kind of variations are there on LDLP to begin with? So I asked the inventor of the MR test for particle number this question, and what kind of variation was there from, so if you measure, if I do the test today and I do the test tomorrow, am I going to get the same number? If I do the test in the afternoon and I do the test in the morning, am I going to get the same number? What does this number actually mean? I was told that there were really no studies on that. He said he did an informal one of the 18 members, if I remember correctly, in his organization. They saw variations as large as 20 to 30% in the same individual month apart, which would be enough to go from the severe risk to the moderate risk. And he also told me a story where he had a test done while he had a cold, and his number had doubled during the cold, and then he had a test done after he got over the cold, and it came back down. So in an ideal world, you would do multiple tests, right, to determine whether or not an elevation is it a bad test? Is it a bad day? Is it stress-related? Who knows? And how does this relate? So there's so much the gist of it is there's so much we don't know, both about the meaning of the elevated LDLP, if it's real, and the meaning of, whether or not it's actually real, and what the meaning is if we're fluctuating wildly from day to day. So maybe you take your last test was 3 days after you got over a cold, and you don't remember the cold. And had you been 10 days after the cold, your elevated LDLP would not have been elevated, and you wouldn't need to be on the drugs.
Stepping back a bit, the whole calories in, calories out debate, from my point of view, seems like an interesting scientific question, but not really practically that important. In the case of the ketogenic diet, its therapeutic benefits are not really dependent on the metabolic advantage that we think it might have. There are lots of other mechanisms at play. But now let's turn to your new book.
So, Gary, your new book, The Case Against Sugar, seems to follow a natural progression of your earlier books, Good Calories, Bad Calories, and Why We Get Fat. And both of those earlier books argue that it's carbohydrates and not fat that have caused the rise of obesity as well as other chronic diseases in this country. So what is the history of sugar in America, and why has it become such a staple in our food sources and as a part of our society as a whole?
Okay, so the history of sugar in America is similar to the history of sugar worldwide in the sense that when it was expensive, it was a luxury. And as soon as it became cheap enough for everyone to consume, we basically consume as much as we can afford. In this case, if we go back 200 years to the beginning of the 19th century, the early years of the Industrial Revolution, sugar was still an expensive luxury. We might have been consuming about 5 pounds per capita per year, which is roughly the sugar in a 12-ounce can of Coca-Cola every week. And that probably would have been more the wage earner in the family because it was a luxury. As the Industrial Revolution brings the price way down, not just of harvesting sugar, but refining the sugar cane into sugar, and then the beet sugar industry kicks up thanks to Napoleon, beginning around the mid-19th century. We see the founding of the chocolate, candy, and ice cream industries in the 1840s, and then the soft drink industry in the 1870s, 1880s, with first Dr. Pepper and then Coca-Cola and PepsiCo. And by 1920, for instance, is the first point that sugar availability in America reaches 100 pounds per capita. So it's an increase 20-fold from, say, 1805, 1810 to 1920. And then it continues to drift upward from there, although not quite as quickly. And it continues to change. How we consume sugar continues to change in the sense that in the 1930s, you see the creation of the fruit juice industry. And if you think about it, we can't consume cold beverages easily at home without having mechanisms to keep them cold at home. And that required refrigerators and home freezers. And you don't see those begin to appear inexpensively until the 1930s. And then vending machines come in the 1930s. And then post-World War II, we see the creation of the sugary cereal industry. So by the 1960s, we've now transformed sugar from a luxury that might have been consumed once a week to the same amount of sugar being consumed roughly every 3 or 4 hours over the course of the day, from your orange juice and sugary cereal at breakfast through, your sugary snack and soda during your morning snack to whatever you're consuming at lunch, whatever juices and sodas. And then this gets worse in the 1980s because beginning in the 1960s, we start to implicate dietary fat as the cause of all our dietary woes. So by the 1980s, even though the government is officially telling us to avoid too much sugar, the public health policy in this country is to get the entire nation on a low-fat diet. And that means replacing the fat in the diet with carbohydrates, and sugar gets kind of a free pass in all this. And the industry even the government even tells industry to go out and create low-fat products and to advertise low-fat products. And one way to make a low-fat product that's tasty is to take some of the fat out and replace it with sugar or high-fructose corn syrup, which by then has entered the food supply in a major way. And so from the 1980s onward, we see another rapid increase in sugar consumption. Sugar's consumption that happens to coincide with the latest phase of the obesity and diabetes epidemics.
In the case against sugar, you observe that diabetes was, until recently, a relatively rare disease, but has now reached what can only be described as epidemic levels in several countries, including the U.S. In fact, diabetes is now becoming a worldwide pandemic of sorts. As recently as World War II, the prevalence of diabetes in the United States was 4 people per 1,000. When I read that in your book, it really stunned me, given that today it seems incredibly common. You say 1 in 11 Americans is now diabetic, but many, many more are pre-diabetic and suffering from insulin resistance. Can you give us some background? I mean, you kind of just did, but with an eye toward diabetes explicitly, can you give us a sort of short review on this? How did this happen?
Okay, and I focus on diabetes in this book because it's an easier target when we're talking about what's the environmental trigger of this disease. So the observation we're trying to explain is epidemics of obesity and diabetes that occur in effectively any population, every population in the world when they transition from their traditional diet, whatever that diet is. So doesn't matter if we're talking Southeast Asians consuming a carb-rich, rice-rich, or wheat-rich diet, to Inuit living on caribou meat and seals and whale meat, or Maasai living on the meat, milk, and blood from the cattle that they raise. When they transition to a Western diet or they become urbanized and affluent, sooner or later you see this explosion in diabetes and obesity rates. And in my book, I go back to the late 19th century where Elliot Jocelyn, a young graduate of Harvard Medical School, still 20 years away from becoming the most famous diabetes physician in the United States and the most influential. In 1898, he goes back through the handwritten volumes of medical records from Massachusetts General Hospital back to 1824. And over the course of 74 years, he is able to identify 172 cases of diabetes in hospital patients. So this isn't even the general population. This is, again, 172 patients, if I remember correctly, out of 48,000 inpatients. So we're talking an incredibly rare disease. And for many of the years between 1824 and the Civil War, Mass General sees 0 cases of diabetes. And then Jocelyn himself sees the rate beginning to increase year by year after the Civil War, and that's an effect you see elsewhere. So that's what we're trying to explain. In some populations, Native American populations or First Nations peoples in Canada, you see diabetes surveys in the 1930s, 1940s, where they find effectively, a handful of cases of diabetes. And then by the 1960s, you have 1 in 4 adults or even 1 in 2 adults with diabetic levels of blood sugar. So even though there are clearly diagnostic changes during this, 150-year period from back in the 1870s, when a physician wanted to diagnose diabetes in a patient, if the symptoms weren't clear, his assistant would taste the urine to see if it was sweet. So you could imagine they underreported a lot of cases.
It's never been good to be an assistant.
Never. It's a ubiquitous pattern worldwide. And again, now you have nations where entire populations, for instance, like the Middle Eastern populations, where 1 in 5 adults are diabetic. And again, you could go back there 50 years and physicians working in these populations would rarely, if ever, see this disease. So the question is, what's triggering it? We know it's not genetic because genes don't change that quickly. And I argue that when effect is so universal that it doesn't matter. We could think of the Inuits and Southeast Asians and South Pacific Islanders and Middle Easterners as all different strains of humans, and you see the same phenomena occur in every strain of human when they transition to this Western diet and lifestyle. So the question is, what is it in the Western diet and lifestyle that's triggering these diabetes epidemics? And again, the argument I'm making is that sugar invariably was the prime suspect at some point when these epidemics begin to occur, and it should still be the prime suspect.
Gary, I thought it was really interesting. So kind of on that note, you make the case that sugar is the new tobacco. Can you expand on that concept?
Well, the argument I'm making, actually, I'm saying sugar should have been the old tobacco as well. There's 2 aspects to that. The simplest one, as I discuss in the book, is that the success of the American blended cigarette that began in 1913 with Camel cigarettes and exploded in popularity around the world in association with a lung cancer epidemic that went with it, that both the epidemic and the success of the cigarettes were due to the technologies used to increase the sugar content of the tobacco leaves. This is a story that the Stanford University historian of science Robert Proctor tells in his book Golden Holocaust, because it's such an amazing story, and I told it as well, even though it's kind of independent of the argument I'm making in the book. But it's because of the sugar content of the tobacco leaves that we find cigarettes so easy to inhale, and because we can inhale them so easily, not only can we get the nicotine into our lungs where it can be more addictive, but we can also get the carcinogens into our lungs where they can have a much more effective at creating cancer. So that's one aspect of this. The other is this simple point that when we talk about cigarettes causing lung cancer, the data there are pretty definitive. Hard to argue with, not that the cigarette industry didn't try. But we don't say too many cigarettes cause lung cancer. We don't say smoking too much causes lung cancer, although clearly there's a point at which you've smoked 1 cigarette too many, and that if you smoked less, you would not have gotten lung cancer. And physicians, because of this, don't tell smokers to smoke in moderation or to cut back on their smoking, or only to smoke at the minimum level you need to smoke to be happy. They don't care about how unhappy their patients are if during the period at which they're quitting. They just say, don't, smoking causes lung cancer, don't smoke, do whatever you can. If sugar causes diabetes, and using that same definition of causality, meaning you take away, if we never had the sugar, in particular, diabetes would still be an exceedingly rare disease, just as lung cancer was prior to cigarettes. Then the message is sugar causes diabetes. It's not about consuming too much sugar causing diabetes or overconsumption of sugar, both of which I consider tautologies anyway. Too much of anything is bad for you, as Mark Twain once said, although he also added that too much good whiskey is only getting started. So anyway, that's the issue is, again, if it is true, what I'm arguing, that clearly sugar should be the prime suspect. You could argue that, hey, we've exonerated this suspect and now we should look for the next prime suspect. But if it's true that sugar causes diabetes, then that's what we say. And then we have to change the discussion about it. And it really gets tricky when you think about, and I realize the Grinch aspect of this, but when you talk about how parents think about moderation in their children's sugar consumption, if it's true that sugar causes diabetes, whether or not there's a level at which it won't happen, which there clearly is, but we don't know what that level is, and it's likely to be different for everyone.
And trying to figure out these mechanisms, as we move forward, what do we know about epigenetics and epigenetic-related changes associated with heavy sugar consumption?
Well, so the argument I'm making in the book is that by saying it's the prime suspect for causing diabetes, we should clarify type 2 diabetes, which is a defect of insulin resistance and associates with excess weight and age and constitutes, I think, 95% of all cases of diabetes. So if sugar causes that, it's another way of saying sugar causes insulin resistance, which is the fundamental defect there. And if sugar causes insulin resistance, then we can look at populations, and I do the third to last chapter of the book is called the If-Then Problem 1. And it's looking at what happens when mothers are insulin resistant. So they have high blood sugar and high insulin levels during pregnancy. So they could be obese or overweight when they get pregnant. They could be gestationally diabetic when they become diabetic during pregnancy, or they could become diabetic during pregnancy. And we have a population that's been studied to see the extreme version of this, and that's the Native American population, the Pima in Arizona. And the insulin resistance during pregnancy. So, for instance, a Pima mother who's diabetic, when she's pregnant, her child is going to have, I'm going to have to look this up because the number is startling and I'm going to forget what it is if I don't actually look it up in the book. In 1983, the NIH researchers reported that more than half of the children who had been born to diabetic mothers had become obese by their late teens. This was more than twice the rate of obesity in children born to mothers who became diabetic only after the pregnancy, more than 3 times higher than the rate for children whose mothers had been healthy throughout their pregnancy. In 1988, with 5 years more to follow these children to adulthood, the NIH research reported that 45% of the children of diabetic mothers had become diabetic themselves by the time they're in their mid-20s, more than 5 times the rate of children of mothers who would go on to become diabetic, and more than 30 times the rate of children of mothers who remained healthy. So being diabetic during pregnancy increased the risk of having a child who was diabetic by their 20s by a factor of 30 over women who never got diabetic.
Okay.
Incredible.
In this population. Yeah. That's a huge number. And the researchers who did this pointed out that the obesity and diabetes epidemics they might be seeing, this vicious cycle of, in effect, insulin-resistant mothers giving birth to children who have a dramatically increased risk of becoming insulin-resistant themselves by the time they're of childbearing age, can then be passed on, will increase with each generation the number of children and the number of adults who are obese and diabetic. And this could explain the obesity and diabetes epidemic seen in the Pima. And what I didn't discuss in the book is you could very clearly recreate this phenomena in animal models. And you could do it just by changing, for instance, either the insulin and blood sugar levels in a rodent model while the mother, the dam, is pregnant with its pups, or even by changing the carbohydrate content of the mother's milk during weaning. So again, one of the interesting, perhaps tragic things we've been doing lately with infant formulas is they have relatively high carbohydrate, and even they have a relatively high sugar content. Mother's milk has lactose in it. It has no sucrose or fructose. And so it's conceivable that we're programming these kids, and I would argue likely that we're programming these kids in the womb to become obese.
So Gary, I know that people have talked about the difference between fructose and looking at sugar itself and toxicity. Can you talk about the difference between those two?
Yeah, and this is an area where there's much confusion, and it keeps generating confusion and as it goes along. So the problem when we're talking about sugars, the kind beet sugar, cane sugar, high fructose corn syrup, we're talking about carbohydrates that are roughly, beaten. Sucrose is a glucose molecule bonded to a fructose molecule. And when we consume it, most of the time, by the time we consume it, that fructose and glucose molecule have already been split into something called, so you've got something called invert sugar. High fructose corn syrup they're monomers. The form we consume it in the most is 45% glucose and 55% fructose. And so it's the fructose that is the sweetest carbohydrate. It's fructose that sets the sugars apart from other carbs, like, grain starches that break down almost exclusively to glucose. And then the glucose goes into our bloodstream, raises our blood sugar, we secrete insulin in response, and then the fructose is primarily metabolized in the liver. So when people talk about the Dr. Robert Lustig, for instance, would argue, his argument that fructose is toxic it's the fructose that differentiates the sugars from the other carbs. But the problem is we always consume it in the context of this glucose background, raising blood sugar and insulin secretion. And so even in my book, when I'm simplifying it, when we're consuming sugary beverages, particularly between meals, you're always getting only like the fructose and the glucose and nothing else. And what we want to know is that combination the combination that's doing the damage? So it's conceivable, for instance, that you could remove the fructose, replace it with glucose, and say we drank, instead of 3 12-ounce cans of Coca-Cola sweetened by high fructose corn syrup every day, we drank the equivalent amount of calories sweetened only by glucose, and it wouldn't be as sweet. So you might have to put an artificial sweetener to make it as sweet, and the calories would still come from glucose. And then answer the question, would that be healthier than consuming the glucose-fructose mixture? And depending on who you asked, and every expert's got their opinion, probably not. Anyway, so the question is let's say we had an experiment where we replaced all these sugary beverages, the fructose-rich beverages, and instead we were just drinking glucose-rich beverages. If we didn't sweeten them as much, we probably wouldn't want to consume as much. So this might be a rhetorical experiment, a thought experiment that you would never see in real life. So let's throw in a little bit of artificial sweeteners and now ask which is worse. I would suspect that the fructose-glucose combination is worse.
So Gary, if you could remove sugar from the modern environment but keep everything else the same, do you think we would have an obesity epidemic?
I think we would still have, an obesity epidemic. I think, remember, there's 2 different issues. So the first thing is what's triggered these epidemics? What was the necessary ingredient to trigger these epidemics? And the argument is that sugar causing the insulin resistance has triggered these epidemics. And then we've seen, we've discussed the intragenetic, intrauterine effects that would be expected to make these epidemics worse with each generation. So we're giving birth to children, more and more children with each generation who are programmed to be insulin resistant in a carb-rich environment, perhaps whether or not it's a sugar-rich environment.
Mm-hmm.
So then the question is, we have a certain level of obesity. We have some people who are programmed to be getting more obese as they get older. Maybe we can mitigate that by removing all the sugar. But if we're replacing it with carbohydrates of any kind, these people are already programmed to be insulin resistant. So now the question is, the first thing we want to do to deal with an epidemic is identify the cause. But having identified the cause, and then now we have to deal with all the people who have been affected by that cause. And I think to deal with them, that's when you get into removing most to all of the carbohydrates, because they're already programmed to be insulin resistant, obese, and diabetic in a carb-rich environment. So it would be a wonderful thing if you could remove the sugar and everybody miraculously got healthy. But I'm assuming that the world is full of obese and diabetic individuals who know enough not to consume sugar already. Mm-hmm. And while some of them may have gotten less obese and less diabetic, the rest, I think we would have heard about it if this was a miracle cure. On the other hand, when they remove all carbs and switch to a low-carb, high-fat diet or ketogenic diet, in that case, we are overwhelmed, or at least in the world you and I live in, we're overwhelmed with anecdotal evidence that it actually reverses the obesity and the diabetes.
STEM Talk is an educational service of the Florida Institute for Human and Machine Cognition, a not-for-profit research lab pioneering groundbreaking technologies aimed at leveraging and extending human cognition, perception, locomotion, and resilience.
So, Gary, can you talk about what brain scans have been showing us in regards to the addictive effects of sugar?
Well, what brain scans will tell us, what we know, and you could see this in scans, is that when we consume sugar, it basically lights up part of our brain called the nucleus accumbens, which is the food rewards, or the reward center of the brain, and it's the same place. The idea is that it evolved to reward behaviors that further help the species propagate, multiply, give it an evolutionary advantage. So basically sex and eating. And then drugs of abuse, by this theory, are drugs that, for whatever reason, happen to trigger this same area of the brain. So you could imagine, over the course of human history, humans consume, try nibble on virtually everything they can in their environment, and just by chance, there's 15 of these things that you nibble on, and it makes you high because it happens to co-opt the dopamine circuitry in the reward center. And sugar happens to do that as well, sugar consumption. I have a friend who's a physiological psychologist who always makes me point out that if you buy shoes, that will also trigger the reward center, and we wouldn't consider it, although clearly there are people who are addicted to shopping. I would bet you that if I put my kids in one of these brain scans and gave them an iPad or a Pokemon Go game on my cell phone, that would trigger the same part of the brain. So triggering it doesn't de facto mean it's an addictive substance, because eating does the same thing. That's where you experience orgasms. But it's certainly an interesting observation. One of the issues I discuss in the book is from the 1980s, nobody really thought to study this idea that sugar was addictive. It was just, the idea was it tastes good, it's benign. Back in the 60s and 70s, even when researchers were going after sugar as a cause of heart disease or diabetes or obesity, they still were not equating it with tobacco. And so its addictive properties were not really of interest. And once the NIH pretty much stopped funding sugar-related research, and the USDA as well, from the 1980s, after the idea was, the sugar industry kind of successfully communicated this idea that people who thought sugar was toxic were quacks. There was only really one research group in the US doing this kind of research at Princeton with rodents. There was a group in France. studying sugar addiction and demonstrating that, at least in rodents, it seems to be more addictive than cocaine or heroin, which is terrible. But the research just wasn't done. And in fact, doing the research correctly is probably immoral or unethical, because what you want to do is study the effects in children clearly. And an argument I make in the book is, if you're a parent, you don't need a lot of high-powered research to tell you that sugar is a sort of a drug with some fascinating psychoactive properties, and one that has to be strictly rationed for most, some large percentage of the children in the world. I have a friend, Charles Mann, wrote the wonderful books 1491 and 1493. He's a journalist historian. And in 1493, where he discusses the history of the sugar industry, he says, scientists debate amongst themselves whether sugar is an addictive substance or people just act like it is. And I think that's about the best you could say. Clearly, we act like it is. So whatever science tells us one way or the other at the moment will only be relevant to whether you can demonstrate that the sugar industry knew it, like the tobacco industry knew about tobacco being addictive and then tried to hide it or maximize it. And it was such a successful product, I find it hard to imagine that they had to do that.
So, Gary, in 2015, the New York Times reported on the Global Energy Balance Network and how they were initially subsidized by Coca-Cola. And the company announced their directive was to combat the ideas being circulated by folks, such as yourself, that sugar and soda consumption were driving the obesity problem. Can you talk about your observations of that story and how insidious is this brand of corporate influence in food science?
Yes, and it's interesting because the takeaway people get from my book is actually different than what I tried to put into it, which has led me to write a New York Times op-ed that ran in January, making the point that the best allies that the sugar industry has are nutrition and obesity researchers. So long as nutritionists and obesity researchers and clinicians insist that obesity is an energy balance disorder, that means taking its cause, literally caused by consuming more calories than the person expends in physical activity or energy expenditure, then it's a valid argument for the sugar industry to make that, A, there's no such thing as a fattening food or a reducing food. The only thing that matters is the caloric content, and you could get fat just as easily by overeating kale or quinoa or grass-fed steak as you could sugar, provided the key is you have to overconsume it. This is always the ultimate argument of the sugar industry. You have to overconsume calories. And then it also implies that you can balance those calories with physical activity. So what Coca-Cola was doing is basically telling the sugar and the nutrition industry, look, you guys all think this is true. And if this is true, then it's not just about overconsuming Coca-Cola or anything else. It's about being underactive, physically sedentary. And so we're going to form a community of researchers who believe that physical activity is crucial and that you can balance the calories you consume with the calories you expend. And then they went ahead and they picked researchers who, historically were very open to taking industry money, let's put it this way, and had been, at least in one case, had been friends of the sugar industry in the past, and they hired them to start this network and kind of kept the Coca-Cola money in the background because they wanted it to look like an academic exercise. The best researchers saying it's a balance, it's energy balance. It's not just consuming too much, it's expending too little. And then, of course, the New York Times caught on to it and exposed the Coca-Cola's role in trying to, they were definitively trying to divert attention away from over-consuming Coca-Cola, whatever that means. But they were doing it by merely reminding the nutrition community and the public health authorities of what they believe to be true, which is if this is an energy balance problem, exercise more. The interesting aspect of all this, so I got into this field back in the late 90s studying the controversy over whether salt causes high blood pressure. And in that case, the salt industry felt that its product was being victimized, indicted, convicted based on very poor analysis, very poor science.
It was
Bad. And it was. And this is what I learned in the course of my research. And the fact is, the salt industry felt compelled to pay researchers to reach out to researchers in the community to say, look, we think the science sucks. We think these people are spinning the data they have. We think they're cherry picking the data. And we think salt is relatively harmless. So can we pay you, independent researcher, to do an analysis to see if we're right? And if we're wrong, publish whatever you find. So because the salt industry did that, when I started my investigation, I also had the studies that the salt industry had funded. And it turned out that I found that science much more compelling. In fact, I put together my own refereeing panel of 3 of the best epidemiologists in the country, one at Harvard, one at UCLA, one here at Cal Berkeley, a biostatistician. And I asked them, I printed out stacks about over a foot deep of the key papers in the field and had them read the papers and referee them for me. And none of them had been involved in the controversy in the past. So they were truly unbiased researchers. And they all agreed with me and agreed with the salt industry. And had the salt industry not have done that, we wouldn't have gotten to the point we are now, where slowly people are beginning to say, wait, the salt restriction, blanket salt restriction advice may be doing more harm than good. And so the sugar industry, if anything, was playing by the salt industry playbook. And in fact, the head of the Sugar Association today used to be vice president of the Salt Foundation, which was the salt industry's lobbying back when I was doing that story. So the problem is that the nutrition research community was really doing top-notch science, impeccable, rigorous, methodical, skeptical science. None of these industries would see their products unjustly vilified. But because these researchers don't, on the whole, do top-notch, impeccable, rigorous science, often industries are attacked. And if your product happens to be one of those that's being attacked, and it's being attacked by a small group, I mean, GMOs are an example today, who do you believe? And the question is, if you think this small group is doing bad science, so you hire influential scientists, ideally independent, to combat that fringe, zealous crew, and then you end up, if you're right, everything's hunky-dory and you're justified, and people clap you on the back. And if you're wrong, you're accused of playing by the tobacco industry playbook. It's a tricky balance to walk.
Do you think the microbiome plays a significant role in obesity and related chronic diseases like diabetes?
I think the microbiome science is too premature to tell. So again, one of the arguments, the primary argument I've been making in my work is that because of all these reasons we've discussed, the obesity researchers decided that basic endocrinology is not relevant to their science, that they could be studying a disorder of excess fat accumulation without caring about the hormones and enzymes that regulate fat accumulation of fatty acid oxidation. They came up with this sort of incredibly misconceived energy balance paradigm, and not surprisingly, they didn't make any progress whatsoever in either treating obesity or preventing the obesity epidemic. So with that as the context, you come along with yet another new technology. So in 1960, the new technology was Yalow and Berson's radioimmunoassay, and you can suddenly, the field of endocrinology explodes, but we decide that's not relevant because obesity is a psychological, a behavioral defect. Now, 50 years later, you've got a new technology which is capable of sequencing the genomes of the bacteria that live in our guts, and we could look at how foods, instead of how foods influence hormonal milieu and how that influences fat accumulation or diabetes status, we can now look at how foods influence gut bacteria and how that might influence diabetes or obesity status. And it explodes, and the media loves it, and it's very popular, and people, there's a bandwagon effect going on that's similar to the gluten-free bandwagon in the diet world. But the history of science tells us that what we're generating is an enormous amount of smoke right now. And because there's so much smoke, you can't even see what's really fire. And then the question is, even if the gut biome is doing something significant because of our epidemic, so it lies somewhere in the causal pathway between environmental trigger of the epidemics, which we know must exist, whatever it is that accompanies the Western diet and lifestyle, and part of the epidemics being insulin resistant and excess fat accumulation. So I would guarantee that whatever causal role it plays in that pathway, it's being triggered by it's got to be triggered by the sugar and refined grains on the intake, because if that's correct, that's what associates with all these epidemics. And then it's got to have some effect on insulin signaling, because it's not just enough to say, well, we change the bacteria and magically people get fatter or more diabetic. In order to get fatter, you have to change the signaling of the fat cells so that they accumulate fat, and you have to downregulate fatty acid oxidation, and those are insulin. Insulin dominates those signals. So it may fit in the causal pathway, and it may play a causal role, and time will tell.
Mm-hmm.
That's a good way to say it.
Yeah, but the input and the output have to be, one other thing just to say about this, back in the 1960s, Peter Cleve, the British naval researcher who first put forth this idea that it was refined grains and sugars on a major level, Cleve said one of the diseases of Western diets and lifestyles that associates with obesity and diabetes is dental caries, cavities. And so when you see a population go through a nutrition transition, the first thing that you see manifest itself is, tooth decay. And then you get obesity and diabetes and heart disease and cancer and all the rest. And we know what triggers the tooth decay. And that's a bacterial issue, right? And it's triggered by the sugars and refined, white flour in the diet. And so it's quite likely that if the rest of the problems are also bacterial issues, they are also triggered by the white sugar and flour in the diet.
Mm-hmm.
That's, to me, makes sort of, that kind of common sense. It tends to be dismissed in this field, yet I find that statement alone to be pretty compelling, or that association. If it's the sugar and white flour causing the cavities are the first of the Western diseases. Even if obesity and diabetes are caused by gut dysbiosis, probably going to be triggered by the bacteria that are triggered in turn by the sugar and the white flour, just further down the GI tract.
Well, speaking of sugar, what is your take on artificial sweeteners like saccharin and aspartame? Do you feel that they have negative effects in terms of signal disruption, or are they a way to have sweet flavors without the hazards of sugar? Any thoughts on their potential effects?
I think the science is out there, and I also think it's a question of what we're comparing them to. So if we're asking the question, for instance, is a half a pound of saccharin as bad for you as 100 pounds of sugar, which would be roughly the equivalent. So those are, if you want to replace 100 pounds per capita of sugar and get the equivalent sweetness from saccharin, you're talking about less than half a pound per year. Is that as bad as a sugar? From the evidence I see and the way I assimilate the evidence, I cannot believe it is. And in fact, because I'm saying I want to know what's the environmental trigger of the obesity and diabetes epidemics, I could identify epidemics that occurred certainly in obesity far beyond before artificial sweeteners showed up in these populations. So in that sense, the artificial sweeteners have an alibi for those epidemics. And I'm going to assume, therefore, that they're not the cause of all of them and that that's sugar. Then the question is, are these artificial sweeteners worse than, for instance, no sweetener at all? And that's an easy thing to believe as well. So if your choice is, I'm going to go from drinking 3 Coca-Colas a day to 3 Diet Cokes, I think you're going to be healthier with the Diet Cokes. Most people. And I think many people need crutches, and these are crutches they can use while they're getting off sugar. Mm-hmm. Are they better off drinking water? Yeah. I think they're better off drinking. The best thing is they switch to water. There are clearly, the artificial sweeteners trigger these sweet taste receptors in our mouth, and these sweet taste receptors happen to be in our gut and in our, on our pancreatic, cells as well. So it's possible that they are doing, that they are harmful in some contexts, and particularly for some people. But the research that I saw, and the last time I looked at it closely, was about 2013. It was at best or at worst ambiguous. You could find a lot of problems with the research, like you study the effects of sugars on college students because you're an academic researcher, and there are a lot of college students around who are willing to be subjects. And maybe the effect on an 18-year-old or a 20-year-old is maybe they're a lot different than the effect on an insulin-resistant 40-year-old.
Mm-hmm. So Gary, as you learn more about the link between diet and overall wellness, how has your personal dietary approach changed?
Well, I gave up starches and sugars and grains for the most part after I wrote this infamous New York Times Magazine story, What If It's All Been a Big Fat Lie, back in 2002. I had tried the Atkins diet as an experiment prior to that, and the results, the effects for me were rather remarkable. There was an economist at MIT who, I was talking to him about the story about the mathematics of the stock market, but I was simultaneously doing a story on dietary fat for the journal Science. We got to talking about the fat story, and this economist told me about his collaborator at Wharton. The father of this collaborator had lost 200 pounds on the Atkins diet, and he said he had lost 40, basically giving up white rice. He's an Asian American, and he said, if you're doing a story on fat, you have to try it. You have to experience this high-fat diet for yourself. I did it as an experiment wholeheartedly. At the time, I had no kids, no wife to worry about whether my heart was going to blow up. And I lost 25 pounds in 6 weeks. So it's as though you flick a switch for some people, at least, where it's like suddenly you're just walking down the street and calories are falling. It's hard to explain. It's a fascinating phenomenon. And then, of course, I slowly fell off the diet, started eating desserts every day, which was equally fascinating. Maybe my body was trying hard to get the carbs back. And then when I did the research for What If It's All Been a Big Fat Lie, and I saw the studies and I saw how heart disease risk factors improve on these diets, I had gained back all the weight I had lost. I was happy to give up carbs again, which I did, and the weight went away again. And I still worried about my heart blowing up. I mean, it's hard to divorce yourself from this belief that you're killing yourself no matter how healthy you seem, which is weird. Maybe I'm just too, lack of a better word, Jewish. I worry.
Well programmed.
Yeah. So, and then as I did the research for good calories, bad calories, and clearly, from all these different lines of research and different fields of medical science and anthropology and even physiological psychology, this story came together, seemed compelling that obesity is indeed a hormonal defect that's driven by insulin dysregulation, and this is the way to treat excess fat accumulation. Just get rid of the cause, and when you get rid of the cause, it's the whole science of metabolic syndrome tells you that that's the cause of that as well, and that we should be healthiest if we eat diets pretty much absent refined grains and sugars and starchy vegetables. So I still eat that way.
So Gary, having learned all that, and you kind of talked about the nutritional aspect, but also from a physical activity perspective, what does a week with Gary Taubes look like?
Boring.
That was concise.
You mean dietarily? I eat pretty much the same things every day. So, I am one of these people who are perfectly happy eating the same things every day. So it's actually my breakfast for the past couple of years has been a salmon salad from my local gourmet fish market on a piece of pumpernickel bread or some toast and bacon. And lunch is usually some kind of chicken or tuna or salmon salad and green vegetables, and dinner is usually some kind of meat, fish, or fowl, usually grilled because we live in California, so we could grill a lot. My wife doesn't like me cooking meat inside. And green vegetables and the nuts and 100% chocolate for snacks.
That's perfect. Well, Gary, we really appreciate you taking the time to speak with us. Time's just flown by. It's been a lot of fun, and you've shared a ton of great information with us. So thank you again for joining us.
Well, thank you for having me. It's been good.
Indeed. Thank you, Gary. It was great.
STEM Talk. STEM Talk.
STEM Talk. STEM Talk.
Wow, so Gary really is an absolute wealth of knowledge when it comes to the history of why Western society eats the way it does and the detrimental impact that is made on our overall health. I think we could have talked to him about this topic all day.
Absolutely. I really appreciate Gary's passion for pursuing the history of a theory. Understanding the history and people involved are important to fully appreciate a theory and its context.
If you enjoyed this interview as much as we did, I invite you to visit the STEM Talk webpage where you can find the show notes for this and other episodes, stemtalk.us. This is Dawn Cornegas signing off for now.
And this is Ken Ford saying goodbye until we meet again on STEM Talk.
Thank you for listening to STEM Talk. We want this podcast to be discovered by others, so please take a minute to go to iTunes to rate the podcast and perhaps even write a review. More information about this and other episodes can be found at our website, stemtalk.us. There, you can also find more information about the guests we interview.